Welcome to WealthRise Stories, where clarity meets knowledge, and knowledge becomes financial power.
Welcome to my channel. Today I want us to take a journey together, a journey back through time, one that somehow carries the power to decode our present and maybe even our future. Get ready, because what we're about to see and hear might leave you thinking long and hard about the world we live in. Imagine this. In the late 19th century, along the cobblestone streets of New York or Pittsburgh, there stood towering mansions, so grand, so magnificent, they seemed to dominate the sky itself. Marble walls, gilded domes, stained glass windows shimmering like jewels, and inside lavish balls stretching deep into the night. Waltz music drifting through the air, champagne flowing like water diamond jewelry, sparkling on the wrists of ladies and gentlemen. Every meal was a symphony of abundance, with dozens of extravagant dishes that most of us today could hardly imagine. A world of silk and velvet, of gold-plated carriages, racing past, carrying people so powerful they could tilt an entire nation with a flick of the hand. And yet, just a few blocks away, or right beneath the shadows of those skyscrapers, was a completely different world. A world of dark, cramped, damp slums where dozens of families packed into a single room. No electricity, no clean water, disease everywhere. Gaunt figures with hollow eyes from sleeplessness and brutal labor dragged their heavy feet out of blazing steel mills, pitch-black coal mines, or deafening textile factories. They worked 12, 14, even 16 hours a day, children included, just to earn a wage, barely enough to keep from starving. Their lives were an endless chain of exhaustion and despair, with no hope for the future. They built the bridges, the buildings, the railroads. Yet they themselves were crushed beneath the wheels of that very progress. Sound familiar? Do these painful contrasts feel like they're still lingering somewhere in our world today? Is history repeating itself only now? The horse-drawn carriages have become private jets, and the steel mills have turned into massive data centers. The era we're talking about, that golden age, produced a generation of men with extraordinary vision, boundless ambition, and an almost unbelievable ability to accumulate wealth. They were the Andrew Carnegies of steel, the John D. Rockefellers of oil, the Cornelius Vanderbilts of railroads. They were the architects who laid the foundation of our modern industrial world. But at the same time, they also carved deep fractures into society. What makes a truly great captain of industry? Someone who can see the future, think big, act big. Gather resources and people to build something unprecedented. Someone whose vision and talent create millions of jobs, fuel explosive economic growth, and improve everyday life. And what thin line separates such a captain of industry from a robber baron, a man who hoards wealth at all costs, stops at nothing, exploits workers, manipulates markets, crushes competitors, all in the name of personal gain and absolute power. When you hear these questions, don't they echo right into the present day? As we look at the tech billionaires of the 21st century, Elon Musk dreaming of Mars colonization and reinventing the auto industry. Jeff Bezos turning Amazon from a tiny online bookstore into a global e-commerce empire. Bill Gates reshaping how we interact with computers. Are they fundamentally any different from the titans of the old age of big business? Both generations were revolutionaries, people who rewrote the way we live, work, and connect. Both amassed enormous wealth and wielded power capable of influencing global policy. They all carried visions far beyond what ordinary people could imagine. But at the same time, both generations faced similar criticisms: monopoly labor conditions, wealth inequality, questionable business ethics. Were their actions truly for human progress, or were they merely disguises for an endless pursuit of power and riches? It was in search of deeper answers to these difficult questions that I turned to the book, The Age of Big Business, a Chronicle of the Captains of Industry, by Burton J. Hendrick. This isn't just some dry business history filled with numbers and charts. No. This is a doorway into a dramatic, almost epic world where extraordinary individuals shaped an era, creating both prosperity and injustice. And in this Connections video series, I want us not only to read the book, but to peel back its layers one by one to understand how those giants built and nearly destroyed the modern world we live in. We'll uncover the secrets behind their success, the ruthless decisions that pushed them to the top, and the legacies they left behind for better or worse. This will be a journey not only through business history, but deep into the nature of power, ambition, creativity, and the moral limits of humanity. We'll see ourselves reflected in the mirror of the past, gaining clearer insight into the challenges our society faces today. We'll search for lessons, warnings, and maybe even a bit of hope. So, are you ready? Let's pull back the curtain of time and see who those giants truly were, and what they've left us in this complex modern world. Hello everyone, fellow travelers on this journey to uncover knowledge and the stories hidden behind the pages of a book. When you hold a smartphone in your hand, when you scroll through giant apps, or even when you open a package delivered straight to your door by a massive e-commerce corporation, have you ever stopped to wonder where all of this began? At what moment did these enormous economic entities, so powerful they now shape the very world we live in, first come into existence? Today we're going to turn the cover of a book that might seem dry at first glance, but actually contains a rich treasury of history, a mirror reflecting our very present. The book I want to introduce to you is The Age of Big Business, a Chronicle of the Captains of Industry. True to its title, this book is a complete and detailed chronicle of the dramatic rise of America's giant industrial corporations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, an era often called the Gilded Age. It tells the stories of towering figures like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller, with the Standard Oil Empire, Cornelius Vanderbilt in railroads, and J.P. Morgan in finance. The book takes us through industrial revolutions, world-changing inventions, dramatic mergers and takeovers, and the unprecedented accumulation of wealth in human history. But I believe that reading history only through profit numbers or the size of an empire is never enough. It's like looking at a painting just to count the brushstrokes while ignoring the soul and the message the artist wanted to convey. That's why in this video and throughout the content series ahead, our perspective will be very different. We won't stop at the dry figures, billions of dollars in profit, or thousands of miles of railroad laid. We won't simply glorify the industrial titans as pure geniuses who built a new world. No. We'll go deeper, reading between the lines of history to uncover the stories of millions of people whose lives were shaped by that age of big business. Together we'll shine a light on the price society had to pay for such rapid economic progress. Imagine this: behind every ton of steel produced, every barrel of oil extracted, every train thundering across the continent, were the exhausted bodies of thousands of immigrant workers paid meager wages, the sprawling slums rising across major cities, workers' health eroded by harsh and unsafe conditions, families torn apart, and natural landscapes distorted by industrial pollution. We won't just look at the dazzling peaks of these empires, we'll illuminate the deep shadows beneath them. We'll explore how this era shaped consumer culture, business, ethics, government regulation, and most importantly, the very nature of human society. A perspective that I believe makes history come alive, relevant, intimate, and meaningful. Not just stories of the past, but profound lessons for the present and the future. And that leads us to the central question we'll be seeking to answer throughout this series. Was the great economic progress, the unprecedented prosperity, worth the cost of social injustice, environmental destruction, and the erosion of human dignity? This is not an easy question, and certainly not one with a simple black and white answer. Our goal is not to judge the past through modern standards, but to understand its complexity, to acknowledge both its light and its darkness. And from there, extract valuable lessons about the relationship between economic society and human ethics. Did these empires truly create wealth, or did they merely redistribute it in deeply unequal ways? So, where will we be going in this exploration? The structure of this video, and potentially the entire series, will be divided into several main parts. First, we'll look at the rise of the giants, exploring the historical context, the key technological breakthroughs, and the economic and social forces that allowed the railroad, steel oil, and banking industries to explode and reshape an entire nation. Next, we'll dive into the faces behind the empires, examining the mindset, so the ruthless and sometimes brilliant business strategies of titans like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan. But beyond their greatness, we'll also uncover the darker sides of their wealth. Building methods, the competitive tactics, and their political influence. Then we'll listen to voices from the factories and the slums, focusing on the lives of laborers, the strikes, the rise of unions, and the social reform movements fighting against exploitation and injustice. This is where our human-centered perspective will shine most strongly. Finally, we'll look at legacies and lessons that never grow old, analyzing how the age of big business shaped antitrust regulations, labor laws, and modern ideas of corporate responsibility. And more importantly, we'll reflect on the parallels and differences between the giant corporations of the 19th century and the tech and financial empires of the 21st century, to see whether history's lessons still hold true. This journey won't just expand our knowledge, it will stir our conscience and push us to think more deeply about the world we live in. It will help us understand that history is not just what happened, but how we choose to interpret and retell it. If you're ready to explore this dramatic but deeply meaningful chapter of history with me, through a more human and complete lens, then hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, get ready for the stories ahead. Let's dive into the age of big business beyond profit, a human perspective. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our channel. Today, I'm incredibly excited to take you on a historical journey to explore one of the most defining periods in the United States, a chapter we'll call the dawn of a new era. We're going to turn the first pages of The Age of Big Business, a chronicle of the captains of industry, and look at how America came back to life after a devastating catastrophe, becoming the fertile ground for the rise of giant businesses. Just imagine this. In 1865, the final shots of the American Civil War went silent. The country was exhausted, divided with hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and much of the South left in ruins. It would have been easy to think this was the end of the American dream. But it wasn't. Right in those ashes, a new seed began to sprout, the seed of industrialization, of relentless innovation, and of towering ambition. The need to rebuild the nation and heal the wounds of war wasn't just a political mission. It was a massive economic engine. Cities needed to be rebuilt, infrastructure needed upgrading, and a unified nationwide market had now been solidified. The North, which already had a strong industrial base before the war, was now pushed even harder to lead this wave of development. This was not just recovery, it was a full-on transformation. From a mostly agricultural economy into an industrial powerhouse, and that's not all. The federal government, having asserted its authority, did not stay on the sidelines. They understood that to reunite the country and drive progress, a strong economy was essential, and they were more than willing to clear the way for business. Let's talk about railroads, the backbone of this new economy. To connect the east and west coasts of this vast continent, The government passed bold laws that granted massive land subsidies to railroad companies. I'm talking about stretches of land spanning dozens of miles on each side of the tracks, turning these companies into wealthy landowners and encouraging them to expand their networks like never before. Think about it, this didn't just give them free land. It also gave them the right to sell that land to finance construction or even exploit the natural resources on it. This was a strategic, high-risk, but highly effective investment that opened up new markets and moved raw materials and finished goods across the entire country. Alongside that came tariff policies. High tariffs were placed on imported goods to protect young American industries from competition with older, more established industrial powers in Europe. This ensured that steel made in Pennsylvania and textiles woven in Massachusetts had a competitive edge at home, creating a favorable environment for American factories to grow without being crushed by cheap foreign imports. The government laid a solid foundation for this growth, acting like an architect, building a wide and relatively safe playing field for entrepreneurs. But what else does an industrial economy need besides land policy and markets? It needs labor. And this is where the story gets truly remarkable. At the same time, ships from all over Europe and even Asia were constantly docking in New York, Boston, San Francisco. Millions of immigrants, Irish fleeing famine, Germans searching for freedom, Italians, and Eastern Europeans escaping poverty and oppression. Chinese workers chasing fortune in the Golden Mountains of California all poured into America. They brought with them dreams of a better life and a willingness to work tirelessly to make those dreams real. Picture the steel mills, the mines, the vast railroad construction sites. They all needed workers. And this massive wave of immigration provided a labor force that was abundant, cheap, and seemingly endless. They worked in harsh, grueling conditions for low wages, but it was their sweat, their tears, and even their blood that built America's infrastructure and giant industries. Their cultural and skill diversity helped enrich American society while creating a young, energetic, and ambitious workforce. These aren't just dry statistics. They're the lives of millions of people who became the living engine of America's industrialization. However, none of this would have truly taken off without one more crucial factor: the explosion of technological inventions. The post-Civil War era saw a stunning wave of creativity that laid the groundwork for entirely new industries. Take steel, for example. It used to be an expensive, difficult material to produce. But with the new Bessemer process, steel could now be mass-produced at a much lower cost. What did that mean? It meant bridges, railroads, factories, and later skyscrapers could all be built on a scale and with a strength never seen before. Or oil. You might immediately think of oil as fuel for cars, but at that time, it was mainly used for lighting kerosene and lubricating machinery. Edwin Drake's first successful oil well in 1859 opened the door to a huge new industry, turning the oil fields of Pennsylvania into the beating heart of an energy revolution. And we can't forget electricity. Even though Thomas Edison is often remembered for the light bulb, it was really the development of an entire electrical distribution system, and later the war of currents between Edison direct current and Tesla Westinghouse alternating current that paved the way for the electrification of factory cities and eventually every corner of American life. Electric power revolutionized manufacturing, allowing factories to operate more efficiently for longer hours and ultimately at lower production costs. Along with that came advances in transportation, like more efficient steam engines, and in communication like the telegraph, and later Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. These inventions weren't just isolated achievements. They formed a technological ecosystem, each one supporting and amplifying the others, creating the perfect environment for mass production, giant corporations, and a truly modern industrial economy. So we've now sketched out the big picture of the fertile ground America became after the Civil War. A reunited country with strong political will, powered by a constant flow of cheap, abundant immigrant labor, and above all, lit by the fire of technological innovation. This wasn't just a rebirth, it was a metamorphosis into a sleeping industrial giant waiting to be awakened. Chapter 1 ends here with the stage perfectly set. But who would seize this opportunity? Who would tap into those resources, harness that labor, and turn those inventions into business empires unlike anything the world had ever seen? That is the story of the captains of industry we'll explore in the chapters to come. What do you think about this period in history? Was there anything that surprised you? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next exciting journeys with me. See you in Chapter 2. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the age of big business. If in the previous chapter we laid the foundation for the idea of the captains of industry and how they began shaping America, then today, let's turn to a new page. A page written in steel steam and the sweat and blood of millions. We are stepping into Chapter 2. The Railroad. King, the lifeblood of the nation. Imagine the United States in the mid-19th century after the Civil War. A vast, wild, untamed nation, full of potential, but also full of distance. From the cotton fields stretching across the South to the glittering gold mines of the West, to the rising industrial centers of the East, everything needed a connection. Not just a mode of transportation, but a literal bloodstream that could pump life goods and ideas across an entire continent. And that is exactly what the railroads became. Before railroads, transporting goods or people across long distances was a nightmare. Traveling from the East Coast to the West Coast could take weeks, even months. Ships drifting unpredictably at sea, horse-drawn wagons slogging through muddy roads or dangerous mountains. The costs were astronomical, and the risks were constant. Because of that, the nation's development was severely limited. The railroad wasn't just an invention, it was the answer to a strategic nation-shaping problem. Miles and miles of tracks sprang up like mushrooms after the rain, cutting through rugged forests, stretching across endless prairies, crossing barren deserts. It turned the impossible into the possible, shrinking space, shrinking time, and creating a unity the country had never known before. It linked gold-rich California to financial New York, connected steel mills in Pennsylvania to wheat fields in Kansas. Railroads were the backbone, the engine driving America's entire economic machine at that moment. And at the center of this railroad revolution stood a name that rose like a god or a devil, depending on how you see him: Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was no newcomer to business. He began his career with ferry boats on the Hudson River, built a powerful steamship empire, and amassed a massive fortune. But with his far-reaching vision, he realized that the future wasn't on the water. It was on steel rails. He sold most of his steamship companies and poured everything he had into railroads with a terrifying level of determination. Imagine being a small businessman at that time and finding yourself up against the Commodore Vanderbilt's famous nickname. Your chances of survival were almost zero. Railroads weren't just a business, they were a merciless battlefield. Vanderbilt and other railroad kings like Jay Gould and Jim Fisk played a game with no room for weakness. Mergers, hostile takeovers, cutthroat schemes, this was their daily routine. They slashed freight rates to impossible lows to crush competitors, then bought out bankrupt companies for pennies, and afterward raised prices again. They manipulated the stock market, issued watered stock shares far beyond the real value of their companies to enrich themselves while devastating small investors. Vanderbilt was famous for saying, "There is nothing I cannot do with money." And he proved it time and time again. He gathered scattered, inefficient rail lines and forged them into a massive, unified, highly efficient system under his control. It was ruthless, but it was the ruthlessness needed to build an empire. But railroads weren't just stories of brutal competition or multi-million-dollar deals. Their impact on everyday American life was profound. A railroad didn't just connect point A to point B, it created point C, D, and E. New towns sprouted along the tracks, transforming empty wilderness into bustling commercial hubs. Chicago is the perfect example. From a small town, it became a massive railroad nexus, a distribution center for goods, meat, and grain, simply because it sat at the intersection of key railroad lines. But perhaps one of the deepest impacts, one we still feel today, was the creation of standard time zones. Before railroads, every town kept its own local time and based on when the sun hit its highest point. Imagine that chaos. A train traveling from New York to Chicago would have to adjust its schedule dozens of times. This wasn't just confusing, it was dangerous. Countless train crashes happened because of inconsistent timekeeping. To fix this, railroad companies took matters into their own hands. In 1883, they unilaterally established 4 standard time zones across the continent. The U.S. government officially adopted them in 1918. From that point forward, the space and time of an entire nation were standardized, laying the foundation for modern commerce, communication, and daily life. This stands as powerful proof that private corporations can sometimes reshape society even more profoundly than the government itself. But no light exists without a shadow. For every mile of rail laid thousands, tens of thousands of people poured their sweat, their bones, and sometimes their lives into the ground. Immigrant workers, especially Chinese and Irish laborers, endured brutal conditions beyond imagination. They blasted tunnels through unforgiving mountain rock, built bridges over deadly ravines, worked under scorching heat or bone-cutting cold. They faced landslides, cave-ins, and explosive accidents at every moment. Wages were pitiful, living conditions, miserable, and discrimination constant. Construction of the Transcontinental Railroad claimed countless lives, people whose names rarely appear in history. They were the silent heroes, the true foundation beneath every steel rail. And then there was the corruption. Railroad tycoons didn't just manipulate markets, they manipulated politics. They bribed politicians to secure free land from the government, massive strips along railroad routes, and to obtain exclusive business privileges. The infamous Credit Mobilier scandal is a prime example where top government officials accepted stock bribes in exchange for approving outrageously inflated construction contracts, enriching insiders with taxpayer money. This exposed a dark side of early capitalism, the unholy alliance between economic power and political power, creating kings who needed no crown, and so railroads the nation's lifeblood. A symbol of progress, connection, and continental transformation. They produced extraordinary figures, like Cornelius Vanderbilt, people with astonishing vision, iron will, and the necessary ruthlessness to achieve their goals. They reshaped the space and time of an entire nation, laying the groundwork for modern America. But they also stand as proof of another face of early capitalism, its brutality, exploitation, and boundless greed. When I think of those railroads, I don't just see massive locomotives rushing across the land or new cities rising. I see dreams, hopes, but also the permanent scars of an era defined by bold innovation and heartbreaking sacrifice. The lessons of the railroad age set the stage for the next generation of kings, those who saw opportunity in entirely new fields. Because once the nation's bloodstream was connected by iron, the next question became, what will we pump through those veins? And that is exactly what we'll explore in the next chapter. Next time we'll shift to another empire, one built on a black liquid more valuable than gold oil. Thank you for listening. See you in the next chapter of the Age of Big Business. Welcome back to the Age of the Tycoons, a chronicle of the captains of industry. In the previous chapters, we stepped into a turbulent period of history, where men with extraordinary vision, or sometimes astonishing ruthlessness, shaped a nation. We talked about Cornelius Vanderbilt, the old eccentric who built his railroad empire with claws out and an iron will. But if Vanderbilt is the symbol of the raw brute force of emerging capitalism, then the figure we're exploring today is a far more complicated story. A story that I believe still holds its full weight for us to reflect on even today. Let's open Chapter 3, Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, the American Dream and its Price. When people talk about the American Dream, they often picture a journey from empty hands to the heights of fame and fortune. And if we had to choose one shining symbol of that journey, I don't think anyone fits better than Andrew Carnegie. A poor immigrant boy from an unemployed weaver's family in Dunfermline, Scotland, who set foot in America in 1848 at the age of 13, carrying little more than hope and a heart full of ambition. Just imagine it, a child working from dawn until late at night in a cotton mill in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, earning a mere $1.20 a week. The smell of oil and grease, the deafening roar of machines, the dusty, suffocating air. That was Carnegie's first world in America. But even in that harsh environment, young Andrew showed a sharp mind and extraordinary drive. He quickly learned how to operate the machinery, then moved on to become a messenger boy for a telegraph company. That job not only gave him a better wage, but also opened up an entirely new world of knowledge. He memorized the city's layout, learned to recognize important faces, and most importantly, taught himself to decode telegraph signals by ear. Thanks to that quick wit and intelligence, Carnegie caught the eye of Thomas A. Scott, one of the giants of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Scott saw enormous potential in this young man and became a mentor and crucial guide in Carnegie's life. Under Scott's wing, Carnegie didn't just learn about business and railroads. He also made his first investments from Pullman sleeping cars to oil wells. He was shrewdly laying the first bricks of the vast fortune he would later build. But the true turning point at the moment when Andrew Carnegie's fate became tightly bound to the industrial history of America came when he saw the future in steel. In the late 1860s and early 1870s, America was booming. After the Civil War, the demand for infrastructure was immense. Railroads needed bridges, cities needed tall buildings, factories needed machinery. And to build all of that, they needed steel, a lot of steel. But at that time, steel production was still very expensive and incredibly slow. And then Carnegie seized on a technological revolution, the Bessemer process. You know, before Bessemer, producing steel was painstaking. It often took weeks to refine pig iron into steel, and the output was minimal. But the Bessemer process, patented by Henry Bessemer in England, changed everything. By blowing air through molten pig iron, it burned off impurities and turned it into steel in less than 20 minutes. Carnegie saw the limitless potential of this process. He didn't just adopt it. He refined it, turning his steelworks into the most efficient production machine in the world. He was relentless in finding ways to cut costs and increase output. He pioneered vertical integration, a concept we've touched on before with Vanderbilt. Carnegie owned everything from iron ore mines around Lake Superior to the ships that carried the ore to the railroads that brought it to the mills, and of course the massive steel mills themselves. That allowed him to control the entire supply chain, cut out middlemen, and drive costs down to the absolute minimum. As a result, he could produce steel cheaper than any competitor and faster than anyone else. By the end of the 19th century, Carnegie Steel Corporation had become the largest steel producer in the world, supplying steel for everything from mighty bridges spanning rivers and railroad tracks stretching across the continent to the first skyscrapers in New York. Andrew Carnegie wasn't just the Steel King. He was the man who built the backbone of modern America. And then, in 1901, at the age of 66, Carnegie did something that shocked the business world. He sold the entire Carnegie steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, a staggering sum at the time, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today. With that colossal fortune, Carnegie became the richest man in the world. But what happened after that is what truly defines Andrew Carnegie in history. He didn't retire to live a life of pure luxury. Instead, he began to put into practice a philosophy he had nurtured for a long time, one he had laid out in his famous 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth. In that essay, Carnegie declared that the responsibility of the wealthy is to use their riches to improve society. He believed that passing down a gigantic fortune to one's children was a foolish indulgence, and that the rich should act as trustees of society's wealth. He didn't believe in handing out money indiscriminately. He believed in creating opportunities for people to help themselves, and he lived by that philosophy. Carnegie spent the last 3 decades of his life giving away nearly his entire fortune, a sum that's hard for us to even comprehend today. Thousands of public libraries across America and around the world were built with his money temples of knowledge for everyone, regardless of wealth. He founded the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Carnegie Institution of Washington to advance scientific research, Carnegie Mellon University, and countless other trusts to support education, the arts, and healthcare. He believed the best use of wealth was to invest in things that could uplift human intellect, health, and peace. His philanthropic legacy helped shape the very idea of modern charities, setting a standard that many later billionaires have studied and tried to follow. A happy ending to the American dream, right? A poor immigrant who clawed his way to the top of the economic ladder and then gave it all away to uplift society. But Carnegie's story doesn't end with grand libraries and noble foundations. To truly understand Andrew Carnegie, we can't ignore a deep scar on his career and reputation, the bloody Homestead Strike of 1892. While Carnegie was in Scotland enjoying his vacation, a fierce confrontation was unfolding at the Homestead Steelworks in Pennsylvania between management and workers. With the goal of breaking the union and cutting costs, Carnegie's close associate and right-hand man, Henry Clay Frick, ordered wage reductions. The workers, already enduring harsh conditions with long, dangerous shifts, responded with a strike. The situation escalated quickly. Frick hired 300 armed agents from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to guard the plant and bring in strikebreakers. When the Pinkertons arrived by barge on the Monongahela River, they were met by thousands of striking workers, many of them armed. A brutal battle broke out, lasting 12 hours and turning the riverbank into a real battlefield. Several people were killed on both sides, and dozens were wounded. In the end, the Pennsylvania National Guard had to intervene to restore order. The Homestead Strike was a PR disaster for Carnegie. Even though he didn't personally give the order to attack, his absence and his decision to give full authority to Frick, a man notorious for his ruthlessness in labor disputes, severely damaged his reputation. It was hard for the public to reconcile the image of the man who wrote the Gospel of Wealth, who claimed to care about improving human life, with the image of an owner who had indirectly caused the deaths of his own workers, the very people whose sweat, blood, and tears had built his empire. It was like a stain that could never be washed away. A reminder that even the greatest figures can commit terrible mistakes, or at the very least turn a blind eye to the brutality of the system they helped create. This always makes me wonder, did Carnegie truly regret what happened at Homestead? Or did he simply see it as an unavoidable cost of progress and profit? Maybe we'll never really know. So, who was Andrew Carnegie? He was a dreamer, an innovator who reshaped the global industrial landscape. He was a legendary philanthropist who set a new standard for generosity. But he was also a ruthless employer who allowed violence in defense of his profits. Carnegie was a man of contradictions. He embodied the very best of the American dream, and at the same time, its darkest side. He believed in giving, but he also believed in making money, at all costs. He loved the progress of humanity, yet overlooked the suffering of the people who worked for him. Andrew Carnegie's legacy still surrounds us today, from libraries to steel bridges. But his story also raises profound questions about business ethics, the responsibilities of the wealthy, and the true price of progress. As we look back on the age of the tycoons, Carnegie stands as a powerful reminder that no great success comes without a complicated story, and sometimes a very heavy cost. In the next chapter, we'll turn to another man who built a completely different kind of empire, equally mighty and equally controversial, John D. Rockefeller and the rise of Standard Oil. Let's see whether he's as complex as Andrew Carnegie. Welcome back to the golden pages of great enterprise, the video series where we turn through the dramatic chapters of industrial history and the titans who shaped the modern world. In the previous chapter, we tipped our hats to the boldness and vision of Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King, who built his empire out of numbers and blazing furnaces. But today, we're diving into a different story. One that for many people is even more haunting and frightening. It's the story of a man who decided not just to play the game, but to create the rules of the game. A man who turned the young oil industry into a massive money-making machine, controlling nearly every aspect of it. That man is none other than John D. Rockefeller. If Carnegie built bridges and rails out of steel, then Rockefeller was the one who poured oil into the engine of the entire nation, and then skillfully strangled anyone who dared to compete with him. Today, we're going to break down the ruthless, yet incredibly effective business strategies of John D. Rockefeller in building the Standard Oil empire, one of the most terrifying monopolies in history. When oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, it ignited a black gold rush. Hundreds, even thousands of small companies sprang up like mushrooms, drilling, refining, and transporting oil. It was the Wild West of oil, chaotic, fiercely competitive, and full of risk. And in the middle of that tangled mess, a quiet man with cold, sharp eyes and a brilliantly calculating mind didn't see chaos. He saw a golden opportunity to impose order and then to control that order. John D. Rockefeller, a young man from a modest family background, quickly realized a key truth: no matter how much crude oil was pumped out of the ground, refining was the bottleneck of the entire industry. He didn't start by drilling wells. He focused on building refineries. In 1870, he and his partners founded Standard Oil Company of Ohio. This was the beginning of a strategy that would later be known as horizontal integration and vertical integration. Horizontal integration. It sounds technical, but at its core, it simply means buying up your competitors in the same segment of the market. Imagine it this way: if you run a coffee shop and there are 100 other coffee shops in the city, horizontal integration is you going out and buying each one of those shops. Rockefeller did this with a level of determination that's almost terrifying. He started by buying smaller refineries. Typically, he would offer their owners a fair price. If they refused, Standard Oil would unleash brutal competitive tactics to push them to the brink of bankruptcy, then buy them up for pennies on the dollar. Within just a few short years, Rockefeller had swallowed most of the refineries in Cleveland, which at the time was the largest refining center in the United States. But that was not the end of it. Once he controlled most of the refining capacity, Rockefeller saw the bigger picture. He realized that to truly dominate, he needed to control every step, from the moment the oil was still in the ground until the moment it was sold to the consumer. And so he began his strategy of vertical integration. Vertical integration means controlling the entire supply chain. Rockefeller didn't just want to refine oil. He wanted to own the oil wells, the pipelines transporting crude to the refineries, the rail cars and ships moving the finished products, the storage tanks and warehouses, and even the retail outlets selling kerosene. With every new piece he added to his empire, he cut costs, increased efficiency, and tightened his grip on the industry. Imagine you're a small company. You have to pay for crude, pay for transportation, pay to refine, then pay again to ship your product to market. Meanwhile, Standard Oil, with its enormous scale, could do all of that in-house at far lower cost. Every dollar he saved was another blow to his competitors, making it impossible for them to match his prices. The final result: within just a few decades, John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil controlled more than 90% of the oil industry in the United States. So how did he achieve this near-total dominance? Beyond integration strategies, Rockefeller used business tactics that today we'd flat-out call ruthless, even unethical. One of his most notorious strategies was predatory pricing. When Rockefeller wanted to buy out a competitor who refused to sell Standard Oil, would open a competing outlet right next door and sell kerosene at rock-bottom prices, even below cost. They were willing to take short-term losses in that area, knowing that with their enormous resources, they could outlast any small rival. Once the competitor ran out of money and was forced to close or sell at a bargain, Standard Oil would raise prices again and make back what it had lost. But perhaps Rockefeller's most powerful secret weapon was his relationship with the railroads. He secured secret deals to receive massive rebates on shipping for Standard Oil's products. Not only that, he demanded that the railroads pay drawbacks to Standard Oil on every barrel of oil shipped by his competitors. Think about how insane that is. The railroads were not only giving Standard Oil special discounts, they were also kicking back a portion of the money they earned from transporting the competitor's oil. That meant every time a small rival shipped oil, they weren't just paying for transportation, they were indirectly funding the very enemy trying to destroy them. It was a killing blow that made it almost impossible for competitors to match Standard Oil's costs. And of course, we can't forget about industrial espionage. Rockefeller had no qualms about gathering intelligence on his rivals, their production costs, their inventory levels, their secret shipping deals. Knowledge is power, and Rockefeller used that power to stay one step ahead, anticipating and sabotaging his competitors' plans. These tactics brought enormous success to Standard Oil, making Rockefeller the richest man in the world at the time. But the cost wasn't just the bankruptcy of thousands of small businesses. It was also the growing anger of the public and the press. People began to see the downside of perfect efficiency, a lack of competition, monopoly pricing, and the uneasy feeling that a small group of men controlled far too much economic power. The press, especially investigative journalists known as muckrakers, fanned the flames of this anger. Most prominent among them was Ida Tarbell, a courageous journalist whose father had once been a small oil producer, crushed by Rockefeller. In a series of articles from McClure's magazine later collected into the book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, Tarbell exposed Rockefeller's dirty tricks in painstaking, brutal detail. She transformed Rockefeller's image from a symbol of clever business leadership into the very model of a robber baron, a greedy, amoral figure, willing to trample anything and anyone in pursuit of wealth and power. Public and government pressure grew stronger and stronger. To get ahead of the emerging antitrust laws, Rockefeller made a clever legal move in 1882. He created the Standard Oil Trust. This was a complex legal arrangement in which the shareholders of 40 different companies related to Standard Oil transferred their stock to a group of 9 trustees. In return, they received trust certificates that entitled them to a share of the profits. In essence, This meant that while the companies still existed on paper as separate entities, they were all under the control of a single management body, Rockefeller's people. It was a way of dodging the law, creating a powerful monopoly without technically breaking the existing statutes against large corporations. The creation of the Standard Oil Trust became the blueprint for other monopolies of the era, and a direct challenge to America's ideals of economic freedom. Its shadow was so immense, and its market manipulation so blatant, that it triggered a strong reaction from the government. The result was that in 1890, the U.S. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was a historic turning point, the first federal law to outlaw monopolistic agreements and actions that restrained free trade. Although the Sherman Act was weakly enforced, at first it laid the legal foundation for regulating giant corporations in the future. Finally, in 1911, after a long legal battle, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil Trust was an unreasonable monopoly and ordered it broken up into 34 independent companies. Those companies later became some of the oil giants we know today, such as ExxonMobil from Standard Oil of New Jersey, Chevron from Standard Oil of California, and BP from part of Standard Oil of Ohio. So, was John D. Rockefeller a robber baron or a captain of industry? The reality is far more complicated. He was an undeniable business genius who transformed the oil business from chaos into an efficient, large-scale industry delivering essential products at lower cost to millions of people. He created thousands of jobs and contributed massively to America's economic growth. Later in life, he also became one of history's greatest philanthropists, giving away the equivalent of billions of dollars to fund medical research education and the arts institutions and foundations that still exist today. But the path he took to build that wealth and power was paved with ruthlessness, manipulation, and the suffocation of competition. Rockefeller's story is a powerful reminder of the thin line between bold innovation and dangerous monopoly power, and of how crucial it is to balance free enterprise with the public interest. What do you think? Do only the most ruthless players get to build empires on that scale? Or is there another path, a more humane way to reach the very top? In the next chapter, we'll leave oil and steel behind and step into an equally turbulent young industry finance. We'll meet J.P. Morgan, a man who didn't create products, but created deals, a man who used financial power to steer an entire economy. Don't miss it. Welcome back to our journey through the age of big business titans. We've witnessed the rise of industrial giants, Rockefeller with oil, Carnegie with steel, Ford with automobiles. They were the great architects, the ones who directly built the backbone of modern America. But have you ever wondered who stood behind those architects, who provided the capital, arranged the deals, controlled the massive flows of money and power, who held the invisible strings that conducted the grand orchestra of American industry? Today we're stepping into a completely different chapter, a chapter where power no longer sits in smoky factories or endless steel tracks. Instead, it resides in dim, luxurious Wall Street offices, in the cold eyes and extraordinary intellects of financial wizards. And no one represents that power more vividly than J.P. Morgan, a name that, when spoken aloud, seems to shake the entire economy. Chapter 5. The Financial Throne. J.P. Morgan's savior or manipulator. If the previous chapters were about creating material wealth, then this one is about organizing, controlling, and even redistributing it. We're talking about financial capitalism. Sounds complicated, right? But actually, it's pretty simple. Imagine this. At first, entrepreneurs like Carnegie or Rockefeller borrowed money from banks to build factories and buy materials. Banks were just places that made loans. But then their role began to change. Investment banks didn't just lend money anymore. They became matchmakers, orchestrators of massive mergers and acquisitions. They issued stocks and bonds for companies, pooled money from thousands of small investors, and funneled it into giant corporations. From there, power shifted. Instead of being mere money suppliers, banks, especially investment banks, became the center of every major economic decision. They didn't need to manufacture a single bolt or nail, yet they held the ownership and control of those massive industrial empires through stocks, voting rights, and board seats. They were the ones standing above the entire economic game, able to intervene whenever they wished. And in the world of early financial capitalism, J.P. Morgan was the uncrowned king. Morgan wasn't a traditional kind of businessman. He didn't build something from nothing like Edison, nor did he exploit labor in the brutal way some others did to accumulate their first fortune. His wealth came from a well-established banking family. But his genius lay in his vision and extraordinary organizational ability. He saw chaos in industries torn apart by fierce competition, and he believed that order was the key to stability and profit. And to create that order, he did something no one had ever done. Before he orchestrated gigantic mergers forming industrial monopolies on a scale the world had never seen. The most iconic and the pinnacle of his career was the creation of U.S. Steel Corporation in 1901. Remember Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King we discussed earlier, the man who said, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." Morgan approached Carnegie and asked him how much he would sell his vast steel empire for. Carnegie wrote down a number, $480 million. Morgan simply looked at the paper, nodded, and said, "I think I can do it." And he did. Morgan didn't just buy Carnegie steel. He gathered competing steel companies, iron ore producers, transportation firms, suppliers. Everything was merged into a single supercorporation. U.S. Steel was born with a value of more than $1. $4 billion, an astronomical figure, equivalent to hundreds of billions, even trillions today. It became the largest corporation on Earth, controlling more than 2/3 of America's steel output. Morgan didn't produce a single pound of steel. He coordinated, assembled the pieces, and financed the entire deal. He issued stocks and bonds, sold them to investors, big and small, and used the capital to fund this historic merger. He didn't just create an industrial empire, he created a method for creating empires through financial power. And U.S. Steel was only one example. Morgan created General Electric, took control of AT&T, consolidated hundreds of tiny railroads into large, efficient systems. His goal was to eliminate wasteful competition, streamline production, and maximize profits. He was the embodiment of the term investment banker in its most literal sense, reshaping the industrial structure of an entire nation. But Morgan wasn't just a cold manipulator of power. He was also remembered as a savior. In an era when the United States had no real central bank, when financial panics could swallow the entire economy, Morgan was often the only person with both the ability and the will to stop disaster. The best example is the panic of 1907. The entire country was gripped with fear. Banks collapsed, the stock market plummeted, people lined up outside banks to withdraw their money. Confidence evaporated. In the chaos, who did politicians and industrial leaders turn to? Not the president, not the government, but J.P. Morgan. What did he do? Morgan didn't sit still. At 70 years old, he gathered New York's top bankers into his library. The doors were locked. He demanded that they commit their personal and collective wealth to save the financial system. He commanded, coordinated, negotiated. He personally examined the troubled banks' books and pumped money from his own reserves and from allied banks into institutions on the brink of collapse. He even forced major industrial firms to invest in the stock market to restore public confidence. He saved the New York Stock Exchange, saved the banks, and ultimately saved the American economy. His actions were so decisive and effective that people said J.P. Morgan was an unofficial central bank of the United States. It's hard not to admire a man with such vision and capacity for decisive action. He was a master organizer, a financial genius, who could see the big picture better than anyone else. But that's also where the haunting question arises. Is it safe for one individual or one financial empire to have enough power to save or sink an entire nation? The truth is, Morgan accumulated more economic power than the elected government itself. He decided which industries would grow, which companies would survive, and when the economy needed to be rescued. Even though he acted out of a belief in order and stability, such concentrated power carried enormous risks. What happens if someone with similar power has bad intentions or simply makes a catastrophic mistake? Should society allow any individual or group to control the entire bloodstream of the economy? The life and career of J.P. Morgan is a powerful reminder of the dual nature of finance. It can be the engine that drives great development, forming giant, efficient corporations. But it can also be a double-edged sword, concentrating dangerous levels of power, capable of manipulation and destabilization. Morgan helped shape America into an industrial and financial superpower. But at the same time, he planted the seeds for national debates about monopoly power, about the government's role in controlling big corporations, and about the complex relationship between money power and democracy debates that are still very much alive today. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, leaving behind a vast and complicated legacy. He was a giant among giants, a man who forever changed the operating system of the American economy. In the next chapter, we'll zoom out and look at the big picture, the impact these titans had on society, and how the government eventually stepped in to control the people who controlled everything. Don't miss it. Welcome to Chapter 6. The Human Price. Voices from the factories and the mines in our journey through the book, The Age of Big Business, a Chronicle of the Captains of Industry. In the previous chapters, we've sat together in luxurious boardrooms, watching industrial tycoons sketch out massive empires on the economic map. We've marveled at their vision, their boldness, and sometimes even their chilling ruthlessness. But like every great story, this one has two sides. And the other side, the one that's less glamorous, less celebrated, but absolutely fundamental to the rise of any empire, is the human cost. Let's put aside for a moment the million-dollar profit figures, the earth-shaking mergers, and the glittering mansions. Today we're going to dive deep into a completely different world, a world of smoke and dust, of shrieking machinery, and the thick, heavy smell of oil and grease. We're stepping into the dark factories and the deep, endless mines where millions of people poured their sweat, their tears, and their blood into building the age of the tycoons. Picture this: a workday that begins before the sun rises and ends long after it has set. 12, 14, even 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. No holidays, no pensions, no health insurance. Just work, work, and more work. And this is not office work with air conditioning and a comfortable swivel chair. These are jobs where every single minute carries the risk of death. In textile mills, bare fingers constantly untangled threads between the whirling parts of machines that never stopped one moment of distraction. Could mean a crushed hand. In steel mills, the burning heat from gigantic furnaces made the air thick, seared the skin, and filled lungs with dust. Can you imagine it? One slip could mean death. One flying spark could cause an explosion. Breathing asbestos, coal dust, and other toxins every day was an open invitation to tuberculosis or black lung disease illnesses that slowly and painfully destroyed the body. And what did people get in return for all that danger? A miserable wage, just barely enough to stay alive. A working family, Even with both husband and wife laboring from dawn to dusk, still struggled to afford enough bread and vegetables to fill their hungry stomachs. They crammed into filthy tenements in overcrowded slums with no electricity, no clean water, where disease spread like wildfire. But perhaps the most haunting, heartbreaking image of this era is that of child labor. When I read the pages describing this, there was a lump in my throat I couldn't quite swallow. Can you imagine a child of 6 or 7 years old, an age when they should be running in fields, holding a school book, laughing without a care in the world, standing instead in a dark mill, their tired eyes straining to follow a thin, fragile thread? Their tiny, nimble fingers were exploited to reach under machines, to snake through narrow gaps adults couldn't reach. In coal mines, the so-called trapper boys sat for hours in pitch darkness, waiting to open and close ventilation doors. In glass factories, small children worked under unbearable heat, carrying loads far beyond their strength. Polluted air, lack of light, poor nutrition, and grueling work stole their childhood, their health, and sometimes their lives. They grew up with crooked spines, lungs full of coal dust, clouded eyes, and a future with no light in it. Women were not spared from this cycle either. They were often paid less than men for the same work, forced to endure harsh labor while still carrying the burden of caring for their homes and children after their shifts ended. Their lives were an endless chain of exhaustion and sacrifice. But human beings in any age cannot endure injustice forever. At some point, fear gives way to anger, and silence turns into a voice of resistance. This is when the first seeds of the labor union movement began to sprout. When individual voices no longer carried enough weight, workers realized that only collective strength could stand up to powerful employers. They began organizing, meeting in secret, forming early associations and unions, even knowing that doing so could cost them their jobs, get them beaten, or even killed. They asked for things that sound almost basic to us today. More reasonable working hours, most famously the demand for an 8-hour day, fairer wages, safer working conditions, and the right to speak up. The history of the labor movement in this period is not just about meetings and speeches. It's about confrontations soaked in blood and tears. We can point to shocking events like the Haymarket Massacre of 1886. When workers in Chicago went on strike demanding the 8-hour day, a bomb suddenly exploded, followed by a brutal crackdown. Many labor leaders were arrested, convicted, and hanged with little convincing evidence. The event poured cold water on the movement, but at the same time, it fanned the flames of solidarity and struggle in the hearts of workers. Or the Pullman strike of 1894, when workers at the Pullman Railcar Company, living in a company town built and controlled by their employer, had their wages cut while rents and prices in company-owned housing and stores stayed the same. Tens of thousands of railroad workers across the country joined in solidarity, paralyzing transportation. The federal government intervened with troops and crushed the strike with violence, leaving many dead and wounded. The strike laid bare the tight bond between government and capital at that time. Friends, these struggles are not some distant, irrelevant history. They were fights for the most basic rights we now take for granted: the right to work in safety, the right to fair pay, the right to rest, the right to speak up when treated unjustly. Every time you enjoy a weekend, every time you work an 8-hour day, every time you receive a minimum wage or have access to benefits, remember that these are the hard-won results of generations of workers who bled and sacrificed for them. The story of the factories and mines of children working themselves to the bone, and of men and women bravely standing up to fight. This is an essential part of fully understanding the age of the tycoons. It reminds us that behind every skyscraper, behind every prosperous city, lie the sweat and tears of ordinary people. And as we move into the later chapters, where we'll see some tycoons beginning to recognize their social responsibilities, and where policies and laws start to change, Let's carry with us the images and voices of the workers who made that change possible. Because history is not only written by the winners, it is also carved into memory by those who had the courage to fight for justice. Welcome back to the channel. I'm WealthRise Stories, and today we're continuing our journey through the turbulent history of America. After exploring the industrial tycoons and how they shaped the economy, we're diving into Chapter 7: Society in the Gilded Age. Inequality and the birth of consumer culture. You know, the term the Gilded Age says everything. It's not the golden age, not solid gold, but gilded. Shiny and luxurious on the surface, but underneath that thin layer of gold lies something far less valuable. And that perfectly captures American society from the 1870s to the early 20th century, a dazzling exterior, hiding deep contradictions, painful inequalities, and revolutionary cultural shifts. Our goal today is to analyze this complex social landscape, the place where extreme luxury existed side by side with extreme poverty, and where the seeds of modern consumer culture were first planted. Part 1. The lavish lifestyle of the newly rich. Let's start at the top of the social pyramid. After the Civil War and the explosion of industrialization, a brand new class of super-rich elites emerged. Names like Vanderbilt, Astor, Rockefeller, Carnegie, they didn't just become rich. They redefined what wealth meant. They didn't just make money. They flaunted it without limits. Picture the massive mansions along New York's Fifth Avenue or the summer cottages in Newport, Rhode Island. These weren't houses anymore. They were palaces. European-inspired architecture, hundreds of rooms, grand marble halls, gold-plated staircases, perfectly manicured gardens, straight out of a fairy tale. Their parties, a completely different story. These weren't just social gatherings, they were spectacles of power and wealth. There were stories of parties where guests received extravagant gifts, where dinner menus stretched endlessly with imported delicacies from around the world served on gold and silver tableware. Women wore silk gowns adorned with diamonds and pearls. One jewelry set alone could feed a working-class family for years. They even held dog banquets where pampered pets were served gourmet meals and wore diamond collars. Some parties even seated guests on horseback inside the ballroom. Sounds unbelievable, right? But it was all real. This was the nouveau riche people who made their fortunes in steel railroads, oil, and finance. They craved recognition, not just for what they earned, but for how they spent it. And that craving created an entirely new standard of extravagant living, a competition of status that set the tone for the world to admire or condemn. Part 2. The darkness beneath the gilding. Life in the slums. But what was behind that velvet curtain? We can't talk about the Gilded Age without facing its darker side. In another corner of America, the picture was completely different. While the wealthy lived in palaces, millions of others crowded into filthy, cramped slums in industrial cities like New York, Chicago, Boston, and Philadelphia. Imagine tall tenement buildings, poorly built, lacking light and ventilation. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people from various families squeezed into tiny, damp apartments with just 1 or 2 rooms. Clean water was scarce, sanitation was terrible, and disease spread rapidly. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, common killers that claimed thousands of lives every year, especially among children. This was home for millions of immigrants from Europe who came chasing the American dream. They worked relentless hours in factories, mines, and mills for miserable wages, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, often in dangerous conditions. Children worked too, just to help their families survive. The contrast is staggering. On one side, parties costing tens of thousands of dollars, millions today. On the other, families struggling to afford a single meal. On one side, bedrooms bigger than an entire tenement apartment. On the other, dozens of people sleeping on dirty floors. This wasn't just economic inequality, it was two parallel worlds existing on the same soil, causing immense tension and resentment. Part 3. The birth of consumer culture, department stores and advertising. Between these two extremes, a new phenomenon was quietly transforming American society, consumer culture. With industrialization came mass production and cheaper goods. At the same time, a new middle class emerged with disposable income. This created fertile ground for a new concept: consumption, as a form of personal identity. Department stores became the temples of consumption. Places like Marshall Field's in Chicago, Macy's in New York, or Wanamaker's in Philadelphia weren't just shopping venues, they were attractions. Bright lights, beautifully displayed merchandise, everything from clothing and jewelry to household items and toys, shopping became a form of entertainment. People spent entire afternoons there, not just to buy, but to browse, admire, and dream. And to attract customers, a brand new industry exploded: advertising. Newspapers and magazines became filled with colorful, persuasive ads, not only introducing products, but teaching people how to live. What to wear, how to behave, how to be a gentleman or a lady. Ads didn't just sell items, they sold lifestyles, identities, and aspirations. Most importantly, consumption started to become tied to personal identity. Who are you? You are what you buy. Owning certain things wasn't just about utility, it became a symbol of status, personality, or belonging. Even the middle class, who could never match the wealth of the elite, began craving luxury-like items that offered a sense of sophistication. Brands gained meaning. Buying a specific watch, wearing trendy clothes, owning modern household items all became investments in your self-image. This was the foundation of the consumer society we live in today. Part 4. Art and Architecture, Mirrors of a Tense Era. So what did the art and architecture of this era say? Everything. Architecture reflected the ambitions of the wealthy. They wanted to assert their status through grand European-inspired structures, Beaux-Arts, Gothic Revival, Baroque. Their mansions weren't just homes. They were symbols of power, wealth, and prestige. Even public buildings, museums, libraries, cultural institutions were built on a monumental scale to showcase America's rising civilization and greatness. We see imitation, admiration, and even attempts to surpass Europe. As for art, while the elite preferred romantic landscapes, formal portraits, and academic European styles, some artists began pointing their brushes toward social realities. Although not yet a massive movement, early signs of realism appeared, artists depicting life in the slums, harsh labor conditions, and the frenetic chaos of industrial cities. These works didn't sugarcoat anything, they exposed the cracks beneath the gilded surface. The contrast between the glittering facade and the harsh truth seeped into every painting, every stone block, every design of the era. The grandeur may impress us, but look closely, and you'll see the shadows of the workers who built it all, earning barely enough to survive. The Gilded Age, my friends, was a complex and contradictory mosaic. It was staggering inequality, the rise of a super-rich elite with unimaginable luxury, and at the same time, the birth of a new consumer culture, where shopping became a form of self-expression. It left its mark not only on history, but on the DNA of modern society. Today we still debate inequality, the meaning of wealth, and the role of consumption in our lives. Are we living in a new Gilded Age? What do you think about the gilding of our era, where glamorous images on social media can mask the struggles behind them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for listening and joining me in this chapter. I'll see you in the next video as we explore more sides of the age of big business. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss anything interesting. Welcome back to our channel. We've explored the powerful rise of the captains of industry, The men who built gigantic business empires reshaped America and created an age of astonishing innovation. And we've marveled at their vision, their boldness, and sometimes even their ruthlessness. But every great story has a dark side, doesn't it? It's time for us to turn to another page, a chapter where the spotlight begins to fade, and a powerful wave of resistance rises from within society itself. This is our Chapter 8, The Wave of Backlash, the Press Reform and the Awakening of the Public. If the previous chapters were about the power of capital and individuals, then this one is about the power of truth, public opinion, and ultimately, government. 1. The Diggers, the legendary muckrakers. Now, if you've ever thought YouTube and TikTok were the only places to expose the truth, think again. More than a century ago, there were pioneers, real truth hunters who didn't use smartphones but pen and paper, and they went deep into the darkest corners of corporations and government. They were called muckrakers, the ones who raked up the muck, and they shook America to its core. Among them, there are two names we simply cannot ignore. First is Ida Tarbell. Imagine you're the daughter of a small oil refiner whose business was squeezed and swallowed by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. How would you feel Ida Tarbell turned that pain and injustice into the driving force behind one of the greatest works of investigative journalism of all time? The History of the Standard Oil Company. Tarbell didn't traffic in rumors or emotional rants. She was obsessively meticulous, spending years collecting documents, interviewing witnesses, and digging into every tiny detail of how Standard Oil built its empire. From secret deals with railroads, to crushing rivals, with unfair pricing, to ruthless takeovers. Her series, published in McClure's magazine, didn't just expose Standard Oil's monopolistic practices. It stripped bare the true face of a giant corporation that had gone too far in its quest for power. It changed how the public saw Rockefeller from a brilliant businessman into a ruthless monopolist. Second, let's talk about Upton Sinclair. If Ida Tarbell focused on money and power, Upton Sinclair went straight for America's stomach, literally. His novel The Jungle, published in 1906, was an earthquake. Sinclair spent weeks working undercover in Chicago's meatpacking plants to expose the horrific working conditions and the inhuman treatment of immigrant laborers. But what truly made the book legendary wasn't just its accounts of brutal labor conditions, even though that was his original goal. It was the gruesome descriptions of how food was actually produced. Rotten meat, soaked in chemicals. Rats running over the factory floors, workers falling into rendering vats and ending up as part of the product. Just imagine you're eating dinner, reading the paper, and suddenly realize the piece of meat on your plate might have come from a plant where a worker literally died into the machinery. The public reaction was one of shock and outrage. This wasn't just about business ethics anymore. It was about their own health and safety. Books like Tarbell's and Sinclair's, along with other muckraking works by people like Jacob Riis on New York slums and Lincoln Steffens on political corruption, sparked an unprecedented wave of awareness. The public, who might once have admired great fortunes, now began to see the price that had been paid for that wealth. 2. The government steps in revolutionary laws. The truths uncovered by the muckrakers became a spark that ignited anger and demands for action. People simply could not and would not accept business as usual anymore. This was when the government, which had previously been fairly hands-off with big business and often let the market regulate itself, was forced to step in. One of the first moves was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This law was designed to go after monopolies, trusts, and anti-competitive agreements in order to protect free competition. At first, it was like a paper tiger, weakly enforced and even used at times against labor unions. Still, it laid down a crucial legal foundation for stronger antitrust actions later on. But it was Sinclair's The Jungle that truly lit the fuse for specific safety regulations. Within just a few months of its publication, under enormous public pressure, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act in 1906. These were the first building blocks of national standards for food and drug safety, forcing producers to take responsibility for the quality of what they sold. And they became the precursors to today's Food and Drug Administration, FDA. You see, sometimes a single story really can change an entire industry and the way a nation operates. 3. Theodore Roosevelt, the man who took on the trusts. And in the middle of this wave of change, a towering figure stepped forward to symbolize government intervention on behalf of the public: President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a president unafraid to confront the giants. He became famous as a trust buster, the man who went after monopolies. But it's important to remember that Roosevelt didn't hate big business outright. He believed in what he called good trusts, large, efficient corporations that behaved responsibly, and bad trusts, those that abused their power to crush competition, exploit workers, and harm the public. His goal was to rein in the bad trusts and ensure fairness in the economy. Roosevelt wielded his power more aggressively than any president before him. He brought dozens of major corporations to court under the Sherman Antitrust Act, most famously in the case against the Northern Securities Company, a massive railroad holding company controlled by J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and E.H. Harriman. When the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government in 1904, it was a huge victory, a clear message that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, stood above the law. He was also a strong supporter of the new food and drug safety laws. Roosevelt transformed American politics, shifting the government from a mostly passive observer into an active regulator of the economy and a protector of ordinary citizens' rights. He helped open the door to the progressive era, a time when the public demanded more from government child labor laws, women's suffrage, and a fairer society. So we've just witnessed a major turning point. From an age where wealth and corporate power were almost unquestioned, America moved into a period when the public and the government began to demand balance. Journalists exposed the truth, the public grew outraged, and political leaders dared to act. The lessons from this progressive era are still incredibly relevant today. We continue to wrestle with questions about corporate power, the role of government in regulating markets, and the social responsibilities of business. The balance between innovation and social accountability, between economic efficiency and social justice. This is a struggle that never really ends, but it all begins with an awakening. We've traveled a long road together, uncovering the turbulent pages of American history. We've witnessed the rise of brilliant minds, empire builders, and the people who shaped the industrial landscape of a nation. From the billowing steam in Carnegie's mills to Rockefeller's endless rivers of oil to Vanderbilt's iron rails stretching across the continent. But today in Chapter 9, we're no longer just telling stories. We're confronting the biggest and perhaps the hardest question of all: the legacy of the giants, captains of industry, or robber barons. This is the moment where we must face the truth. No story has only one side, and history is always a tapestry woven from threads of both light and darkness. Our goal today is to summarize and evaluate the complex dual legacy of these industrial leaders. Were they truly the builders of America's economic power? Or were they exploiters who undermined democratic values? Let's start with the argument supporting the title Captains of Industry. Sounds grand, doesn't it? And in many ways, they deserve to be called that. First, we cannot deny their role in innovation and wealth creation. Just imagine before Carnegie steel was expensive and hard to produce. He revolutionized the process, making steel cheaper, more accessible, and ultimately the foundational material for everything from bridges spanning the Mississippi to skyscrapers touching the clouds to the nationwide railroad network. Rockefeller did the same with oil, not just pumping it out of the ground, but optimizing the entire supply chain from drilling to refining to distribution, bringing kerosene light into nearly every home. These were genius minds, visionaries, who dared to turn bold ideas into reality. They didn't just enrich themselves, they ushered in a new era of technology and convenience. Second, we must acknowledge jobs and opportunity. As harsh as working conditions were, these industries created millions of jobs. Hundreds of thousands of immigrants poured into America from Europe, finding hope and a fresh start in factories, mines, and railroad construction sites. From scattered farming towns, the U.S. transformed into an industrial powerhouse with bustling cities where people could earn a living and build a future. Their empires were enormous machines, and they needed countless hands to keep them running. And finally, we cannot ignore their tradition of large-scale philanthropy. After amassing immense fortunes, many of these captains turned to giving. Andrew Carnegie famously declared, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." He donated most of his wealth to building thousands of public libraries, founding educational institutions, and supporting scientific research. Rockefeller, despite heavy criticism for his business practices, became one of the greatest philanthropists in history, establishing the University of Chicago, the Rockefeller Foundation, and funding public health and scientific breakthroughs, including major campaigns against infectious diseases. They believed that the wealthy had a duty to use their fortune to elevate society. And honestly, when we look only at these contributions, we see a bright picture, one where visionary leaders helped lift America from a young nation into an economic superpower. But as I said, history is never a straight line. Alongside the proud title Captains of Industry, there's another sharper and far more controversial, robber barons. And the arguments for this label are just as compelling. Let's look at how they acquired their wealth. We've seen how they used monopolistic tactics and ruthless competition to crush their rivals. Rockefeller's Standard Oil destroyed smaller companies by slashing prices so low that no one could compete, then buying them out for pennies, or using influence to pressure railroads into giving him secret rebates that pushed competitors to the brink of collapse. Vanderbilt, too, was infamous for brutal battles for railroad control, full of manipulation and cutthroat strategies. Their ultimate goal: absolute market domination. They created trusts to manipulate prices, eliminate competition, and exert total control. This suffocated innovation from small businesses and created an unfair, uneven playing field. Second, and perhaps most damning, was their relentless exploitation of labor. Their factories, mines, and construction sites were dangerous places, with grueling hours, 12, 16 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week, poverty wages, and zero safety standards. Children worked in brutal conditions. And when workers tried to unite and demand fair treatment, they were met with violence, sometimes from private armies, sometimes from government troops acting on behalf of the wealthy. Bloody conflicts like the Homestead Strike and the Pullman Strike stand as brutal reminders of how far these men were willing to go to protect their profits. And finally, there was corruption and political manipulation. With their massive fortunes, these barons bought politicians, lawmakers, and judges. They forged hidden alliances with legislators to pass favorable laws or block those that might restrain them. This eroded public trust in democratic institutions, creating the impression that government served the ultra-rich, not the people. Two sides of one coin. On one side, the brilliance of builders. On the other, the cruelty of exploiters. So the question becomes, in the long run, which legacy truly shaped the world we live in? In my view, their legacy lies not just in who they were, but in what they left behind, both the good and the bad. First, they shaped the modern corporate structure. Large-scale organizational management, specialized departments, complex hierarchies, massive capital mobilization, these originated from their empires. Today's multinational corporations still operate on foundations laid by these industrial giants. Second, and directly in response to their monopolistic abuses, came the creation of antitrust law. Their overwhelming power forced the government to act. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and later the Clayton Act became crucial tools to protect fair competition and consumer rights. Even today, antitrust law remains essential, especially in debates over modern tech giants. Third, as we mentioned, is the tradition of organized large-scale philanthropy. Foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation created a new model for strategic giving, long-term system-level solutions rather than random charitable gifts. Whatever their motives, whether genuine goodwill or image-cleansing, their philanthropic impact is undeniable and still felt today. So what do we learn from all this? The first and perhaps most important lesson is about the complex relationship between wealth power and social responsibility. When an individual or corporation accumulates immense power, a profound ethical question arises. Do they use that power for the common good or only to strengthen their own position? The stories of these giants remind us that great power always carries great responsibility, a responsibility not everyone is willing to bear. Second, it reveals the essential role of government in regulating markets. As much as we celebrate free enterprise, history shows that a lack of regulation can lead to devastating abuses and deep social injustice. Government must serve as a counterweight, protecting public interest and ensuring that economic progress doesn't come at the expense of the most vulnerable. And finally, I think their story is a reminder of the true nature of the American dream. It promises opportunity for all, but also exposes the dark side of unrestrained competition, where ambition can morph into greed and success can be built on the sacrifices of others. My friends, there is no simple answer to the question, captains of industry or robber barons. Both labels have strong evidence behind them. They were extraordinary people with enormous flaws, builders and destroyers at the same time. Their legacy is a mirror reflecting the complexity of human nature and the evolution of society itself. With everything we've explored, I want to leave you with a question, one I've wrestled with myself throughout this journey. In your opinion, which legacy has had the greater impact on the world we live in today? The innovation and philanthropy of the captains, or the exploitation and monopolistic power of the robber barons? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspectives. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey through the age of big business. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. See you again soon for deeper dives into history and the lessons it still teaches us today. I know we've gone on quite a long journey together through the turbulent age of big business in American history. We've explored the stories of the great captains of industry, the people who helped define an era, along with all the debates surrounding their power, their wealth, and their influence. But today, I'd like us to set aside the numbers and the historic mergers for a moment and look at a bigger question, one that I personally keep asking myself every time I close this book. Does history really repeat itself? Or at the very least, does it rhyme with what we're seeing today? This is Chapter 10, Lessons for the 21st Century. Is history repeating itself? You see, when we talk about John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil empire, about Andrew Carnegie and his steel, or Cornelius Vanderbilt and his transcontinental railroads, we're talking about men who built gigantic empires and controlled the essential economic lifelines of the nation. They held extraordinary power, not just financial, but political and social as well. They could set prices, determine wages for tens of thousands of workers, and even influence national legislation. But think about this for a second. Today, who are the new kings of industry? It's not oil. It's not steel. It's data algorithms and connectivity. We have Jeff Bezos with Amazon, a massive empire of e-commerce logistics and cloud computing. We have Mark Zuckerberg with Meta controlling social networks that billions of people use every day, shaping how we communicate and consume information. We have Sundar Pichai running Google, the world's information gateway, and Tim Cook at Apple, not just selling devices, but running an entire ecosystem of services. Just as Rockefeller once controlled nearly the entire U.S. oil supply, or Carnegie dominated steel, today's tech giants hold near monopoly power over our digital highways. They don't just offer a single product or service. They build entire ecosystems that we can hardly step out of. When Google holds over 90% of global search, when Amazon is the first place you think of for online shopping, or Facebook is where you connect with friends, that's not just convenience. That's control. And just as the old industrial bosses were accused of strangling competition by buying up smaller rivals or undercutting them on price, big tech is doing something very similar. They acquire promising startups before they become real threats. They absorb competitors' features into their own platforms, or they simply leverage their massive scale to make it nearly impossible for smaller players to compete. The ghost of monopoly from the 19th century is back wearing a different outfit, but with undiminished power. However, there is one dimension where the power of today's tech giants is even more subtle and far-reaching. That is the issue of data privacy. For Rockefeller, his oil was the stuff pumped out of the ground. For big tech, their oil is our personal information. Every click, every search, every conversation, every photo you upload, everything is collected, analyzed, and turned into an asset. We're living in an era of surveillance capitalism where our data isn't just information, it's a highly valuable commodity. Tech corporations know more about us than any government in history ever has, and that knowledge gives them incredible power to influence, nudge, and even manipulate our behavior and beliefs. This is something the tycoons of the 19th century never had to deal with. And it poses completely new ethical and social challenges. Alongside that, we can't ignore working conditions in today's gig economy. Looking back, we talked about brutal steel mills and dangerous coal mines, places where workers were exploited, working endless hours for low pay, with no safety nets or benefits. Today, while we may no longer see giant machines crushing bodies in factories, we do see millions of workers in the gig economy, delivery, drivers, ride-share drivers, freelancers on digital platforms, facing a new kind of exploitation. On paper, they're their own boss. In reality, they're controlled by algorithms, lack basic benefits, have no job security, and must compete fiercely just to make ends meet. That feeling of isolation, of being optimized by a faceless system, isn't so different from the assembly line workers in Ford's plants or Carnegie's mills. So, do you hear the echoes of history? Think back to the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, or Theodore Roosevelt's crusade against the trusts, the big monopolistic corporations. That was the moment when government and the public realized that unchecked corporate power could threaten democracy and economic fairness. Today, we're seeing something similar. Antitrust hearings targeting big tech, new privacy laws like Europe's GDPR, heated debates over whether we should break up the tech giants. All of this shows a society reacting to concentrated power. It's like watching a movie we've seen before, same plot line, but with new actors and high-tech scenery. But there is one very important difference. The old trusts were physical entities, factories, railroads, mines, tangible assets. Breaking them up, while difficult, was still relatively straightforward in concept. Today's digital empires are built on data algorithms and network effects. How do you break up a social network whose core value is the fact that everyone is on it? How do you dismantle a search engine whose power comes from analyzing the behavior of billions of users? These are far more complex questions, and they demand creative solutions, not just copy-pasting old laws onto new realities. So what's the most important thing I hope you take away from this chapter? That history doesn't have to repeat itself exactly, but it definitely rhymes. The lessons from the age of big business about the need to rein in corporate power, to protect fair competition, to safeguard workers' rights, and to guard against extreme inequality are still fully relevant, maybe even more urgent than ever. Understanding the past isn't about complaining or being afraid of it. It's about equipping ourselves with a sharper lens to analyze the present, to recognize patterns, to spot emerging risks. It helps us ask the right questions. Do we want a future where power is concentrated in the hands of a few? Or a future where innovation and opportunity are more widely shared? Do we want to be passive consumers or active citizens shaping our digital world? The age of the old industrial tycoons shaped one century. The age of today's tech giants is shaping the 21st. And our understanding, our participation, and our willingness to learn from the past will be the key to making sure we don't repeat the same mistakes so that we can build a future that's fairer, less unequal, and where technology serves people, not the other way around. Thank you for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you see any other parallels? And in your opinion, what should we be doing to make sure history doesn't repeat its worst mistakes? Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dives. I'll see you in the next video. So we've turned the turbulent pages of the age of big business together, exploring how industrial tycoons like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan shaped the world and left a legacy that still stretches into our present. We've seen the incredible power of innovation, relentless ambition, and also the controversial shadows of monopoly and labor exploitation. But history isn't just something we admire from a distance or nod along to as a set of obvious truths. It's a mirror, a reminder that what has happened before can happen again. And more importantly, it gives us tools to understand and shape the present. What I want you to take away is not just knowledge, but the ability to act the awareness of a 21st century citizen. That's why today, I want to introduce a 7-day action plan. This is not a test. It's a personal exploration, a way for us to apply historical thinking to everyday life, to become smarter consumers, more conscious citizens, and most importantly, people who help write the next pages of history. Think of this as a small but meaningful challenge we're going to take on together. 7-day action plan, applying historical lessons to real life. Day 1-2, analyze a big tech company. We've spent a lot of time talking about the steel and oil barons of the past. But what about the giants of our era, who are the new titans quietly shaping your life every second? For the first 2 days, I'd like you to pick one major tech company you use often or hear about all the time. It could be Google with its dominance in search and digital ads, Apple with its closed ecosystem and massive brand value, Meta Facebook with its deep influence on our relationships, and News Amazon with its e-commerce and cloud empire, or any other giant you feel has a big impact. Once you've chosen, spend some time 1-1. Looking for signs of monopoly power. Are they controlling a large part of their market? Do they acquire a lot of smaller competitors? Are there signs they might be over-controlling, limiting competition, or forcing smaller partners to play by their rules? Look at antitrust lawsuits, new regulations targeting them. Do you personally feel like you have few real alternatives to their products or services? 2. Exploring how they treat their workers. Are there stories about working conditions, pay policies, or company culture? Especially look at lower-level positions or roles not directly tied to high tech, for example. Warehouse workers, delivery drivers, content moderators. Are there controversies around worker rights, unionization, or big wage gaps between level? The goal of days 1 and 2 isn't to turn you into a professional investigator or a hardcore critic. It's simply to help you observe consciously. Ask yourself, how are these huge economic entities shaping our world? Is history repeating itself in a new form, with power once again concentrated in the hands of a few? And how does that affect you? Day 3-4. Learn about workers' rights where you live. Support ethical businesses. After looking outward at the giants, let's come back closer to ourselves and our communities. 1. Research workers' rights. Take some time to learn about labor rights where you live and work. How does your local or national law protect workers, for example, in Vietnam? We have the Labor Code with regulations on employment contracts, working hours, wages, social insurance, and the right to form unions. Are there organizations fighting for workers' rights if you're currently working? Try digging deeper into your own company's policies. Do they comply with the law? Do they genuinely create good conditions for employees? This is how you equip yourself with knowledge, not just for your own sake, but also to better protect those around you. 2. Support ethical businesses. This is where we put into practice what I like to call voting with your wallet. When you shop or choose services, try to prioritize businesses that clearly commit to ethics, social responsibility, and fair treatment of workers. Look for things like fair trade labels, small local businesses, or companies that are transparent about their supply chains and working conditions. It doesn't have to be a grand gesture. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing a local coffee shop instead of a massive chain, or buying from producers that care about the environment. Every purchasing decision you make sends a message. When we support ethical businesses, we're sending a strong signal to the market. Consumers care not only about product quality, but also about how it's made and how the people behind it are treated. Day 5-6. Read an article or watch a documentary on today's economic inequality. Reflect on solutions. Industrial tycoons of the past were often criticized for creating huge disparities in wealth and opportunity. That problem hasn't disappeared in the modern world. For these 2 days, I'd like you to dig into the topic of current economic inequality. There are plenty of reliable sources reports from organizations like Oxfam, the IMF, or the World Bank. In-depth articles from outlets like The Economist, The New York Times, The Guardian, or documentaries on platforms like Netflix or YouTube. After you absorb some of this information, take time to think. What are the causes of this inequality? Is it the system policy choices or a lack of public awareness? What solutions are being proposed or tested elsewhere? For example, progressive taxation, minimum wage policies, free or affordable education, social safety nets, etc. Can you think of any solutions for your own community or country? It could be a small idea, a shift in mindset, or a big policy vision. Don't be afraid to dive into the numbers and stories. This step is about more than just knowing the issue. It's about building critical thinking and starting to search for directions forward. Understanding the causes and consequences of economic inequality is the first step toward imagining a fairer society, and one where people aren't left behind simply because of where they were born or their family background. Day 7. Write down 3 ethical principles you believe every business should follow. Share and discuss with others. On the final day of this plan, it's time to bring everything you've learned and reflected on over the past week together. 1. Create 3 ethical principles. Write down 3 core ethical principles that you believe every business, big or small tech manufacturing or services, should follow. They might include things like fair wages and decent working conditions for all employees, transparency in business practices and accountability to customers and society, responsibility toward the environment and local communities, prioritizing social welfare over maximizing profit at all costs, not abusing market power to crush competitors or exploit consumers, or anything else you feel is most important after your week of exploration. 2. Share and discuss. Don't keep these principles to yourself. Share them with friends, family, or even on social media. Start a conversation. Ask others if they agree what they would add or remove, or what principles they believe are essential. The goal is not to get everyone to fully agree with you, but to spark dialogue. Through discussion, we learn from one another, broaden our perspectives, and strengthen our own beliefs. This is how we build a sense of community and plant the seeds of a new way of thinking about the role and responsibility of business in society. So we've completed the 7-day action plan. I know a week is short, and what we've explored is only the tip of a massive iceberg. But this is just the beginning. Every small action, every conscious thought, every meaningful conversation contributes to bigger change. The lessons from the age of big business are not fairy tales with a neat ending. They're warnings and hard-won experiences we can apply to today's world to build a better future. Remember, history isn't a finished story. It's a continuous flow. And we, through our choices and actions, are the ones writing its next chapters. Challenge yourself to follow through with this plan. And don't forget to share your experience, what you discovered, what you felt, and the ethical principles you believe in down in the comments. I'd really love to hear what you've learned and what you stand for. We've just gone on a real adventure together, diving deep into every page of the age of big business, a chronicle of the captains of industry, a mesmerizing chronicle of the people, the ideas, and the darker undercurrents of a glorious era. I know 130 minutes of content is no small thing, and you may have found yourself swept up in the dramatic stories, the bold business strategies, and the sobering lessons about rise and fall. But now, after everything we've explored together, it's time to distill. It's time to step back and look at the full picture to pull out the deepest meanings. My goal today is to help you walk away with 3 core messages, 3 essential truths of this great era. Things that I believe resonate powerfully not only in history, but in the world we live in right now. These are not just lessons from the past. They are mirrors, warnings, and sources of inspiration for the present and the future. Let's dive into 3 key takeaways, the essence of a great era right now. Point 1. Innovation and personal ambition can reshape an entire society, but they almost always come with a human cost we cannot ignore. When I think about this great era, the first thing that always comes to mind is the explosion of ideas. Imagine at a time when brilliant minds like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt didn't just dream, they turned the wildest dreams into reality. They saw opportunities no one else had seen and built colossal industrial empires from oil, steel, and railroads to finance. These people weren't just business owners. They were architects of a new age. The innovations they brought from more efficient production processes and vast transportation networks to making distant goods available at lower prices completely transformed how people lived, worked, and interacted. They created countless jobs, fueled urban growth, and laid the groundwork for the modern industrial society we live in today. But hold on a second. Whenever I read these stories, I'm torn by a harsh truth. Every one of those great leaps forward came with a price. And that price was usually paid by those with the least power. Think about the workers. They labored in brutal conditions for meager wages in blazing hot steel mills or dark, dangerous mines. Children worked. Women toiled 12, 16 hours a day to earn just a few coins. Workplace accidents where routine sanitation was poor and safety was a luxury most never had. Cities grew at breakneck speed, but along with them came slums, severe pollution, and widening inequality. Even farmers were squeezed by monopolistic railroad rates. Small businesses were swallowed up by giant corporations. All of that is part of the human cost we cannot gloss over. Those captains of industry, with their bottomless ambition, often stepped on a lot of people to climb to the top. They weren't always noble heroes. They were geniuses, yes, but at times also ruthless and lacking in conscience. To me, this lesson cuts really deep. It doesn't let us flatten history into a simple tale of heroes and villains. It forces us to confront the complexity of progress, how its dazzling brilliance can hide deep scars on the body of society. And that's still true today, when we look at the dark sides of the digital age, artificial intelligence, or today's giants. The question is always, do we have the courage to look directly at the cost and to find ways to reduce it? Point 2. Economic power, when left unchecked, tends to concentrate, and that concentration threatens both democracy and social justice. From the first point, it's easy to see that when people with big ambitions are given power without oversight, the consequences can be severe. And that brings us to point 2. Economic power, when left unchecked, tends to concentrate, and that concentration threatens both democracy and social fairness. Think back to what we discussed about trusts and monopolies, massive entities like Rockefeller's Standard Oil or Carnegie's U.S. Steel. They weren't just competing. They wanted to dominate. They used every tactic at their disposal, buying out rivals, squeezing suppliers, slashing prices to ruin smaller firms. The endgame was clear: eliminate competition and hold all the power in a single industry. When economic power concentrates in the hands of a few individuals or corporations, the consequences are huge. First, it distorts the free market. Without competition, there's no real incentive to innovate. Prices can be pushed to unreasonable levels and quality can slip. In the end, it's the consumer who pays the price. Second, and this is even more frightening, economic power easily morphs into political power. These industrial barons didn't hesitate to use their fortunes to influence politicians and lawmakers. They lobbied, bribed, and bankrolled campaigns to ensure the laws passed would favor their empires rather than the public good. They could control the press, shape public opinion, and silence critics. This creates a dangerous cycle. More money, more political power, more favorable rules, even more money. A real democracy requires a balance and dispersion of power. But when a small group holds enormous economic power, they can bend democratic processes, turning the government into a tool that serves them, not the people. The result, inequality deepens. A small elite lives in unimaginable luxury, while the vast majority struggle just to get by. There can be no real social justice when opportunities are unevenly distributed, and when the voices of the wealthy drown out those of the poor. This makes me think a lot about our world today. We live in an era of massive tech corporations, of data and algorithms. Are we witnessing a new form of concentrated economic power? And is it threatening our democracy and social fairness? The lesson from the Great Era is a cold reminder: if we're not vigilant, history can repeat itself in a different costume. Point 3. History shows that real progress comes from the ongoing struggle between the power of capital and the voice of the people. After looking at the dark side of unrestrained ambition and unchecked economic power, you might be feeling a bit pessimistic. But I want to end with a point that carries a lot more hope and also a reminder of our responsibility. That's point 3. History shows that real progress comes from the ongoing struggle between the power of capital and the voice of the people. The world isn't a stage where only the captains of industry perform. Alongside their rise, another force was awakening the people. It was workers who were exploited, farmers who were squeezed, journalists who risked everything, and passionate social reformers who stood up and demanded fairness. They pushed back. We saw historic strikes like the Homestead Strike and the Pullman Strike. Even though they were brutally suppressed, they planted seeds for the labor movement. We saw the rise of the muckrakers, fearless investigative journalists who exposed the brutal realities inside corporations and shocked the public conscience. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle is a classic example revealing the horrors of the meatpacking industry and leading to crucial food safety laws. The public's reaction and the pressure they created forced governments to respond. This helped usher in the progressive era with a wave of laws and regulations designed to rein in monopoly power. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the creation of agencies like the Interstate Commerce Commission (ICC) to regulate railroads, and later the Federal Trade Commission (FTC) to combat unfair business practices, all of these were direct results of that struggle. This wasn't a one-time victory. It's an ongoing tug-of-war. The power of capital is always looking for loopholes, always pushing to maximize profit, sometimes at the expense of human dignity. And the voice of the people of justice, of fairness, has to keep rising to make sure the scales don't tip too far. Real progress doesn't just come from inventing new machines or building massive factories. It comes from improving the quality of life for everyone, ensuring each citizen has a voice, and creating a society that is more just and humane. This lesson gives me a lot of hope. It shows that even against seemingly unbeatable forces, the collective will, solidarity, and belief in justice can still drive change. It reminds us that democracy is not a static state. It's a continuous process of struggle and creation. And each of us as citizens plays a part in that struggle. When we stand up for our rights, support fair policies, and speak out against injustice, we're continuing that great historical fight to build a better society, one. So my friends, here are the 3 core messages I hope you carry with you after our journey through this great era. 2. Innovation and personal ambition can reshape an entire society, but they almost always come with a human cost we cannot ignore. 3. Economic power, when left unchecked, tends to concentrate, and that concentration threatens both democracy and social fairness. History shows that real progress comes from the ongoing struggle between the power of capital and the voice of the people. The echoes from the past, from smoke-filled steel mills, from roaring locomotives crossing the continent, from strikes and landmark court cases, still resonate today. They remind us of the challenges societies have faced, the lessons learned in blood and sacrifice, and the struggles that are still ongoing. I hope these points help you see our world with a deeper perspective, and maybe even inspire you to reflect on your own role in shaping the future. What do you think of these 3 points? Which one resonates with you the most? Which one makes you think the hardest about the world we live in today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your perspectives. We've traveled back in time together, turning page after page of the age of big business to explore a turbulent era where tycoons like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller used vision, boldness, and sometimes sheer ruthlessness to shape the economy and society we live in today. We've seen how they built empires from nothing, how they faced brutal competition, and how their legacies are still stamped all over the global landscape. But the story of power, innovation, and giants of the business world never stays locked in the past. It continues right here, right now, in every line of code, every investment decision, every new piece of technology that comes into the world. And I believe each of us has our own perspective, our own unique puzzle piece to complete that picture. Now it's your turn. After everything we've dug into and reflected on together, I genuinely want to hear from you. Who do you think is the Andrew Carnegie or John D. Rockefeller of the 21st century? Let's set aside the obvious names and most familiar faces for a moment. Think instead about the people and organizations that are truly holding the power to shape our future. They might be the CEOs of massive tech corporations, the ones controlling the flow of global information and data. They might be quiet behind-the-scenes venture capitalists, funding breakthrough ideas that could change the world. Or they could be lesser-known figures who nonetheless have deep influence over supply chains, energy, or the way we interact with each other every single day. I don't just want you to name them. I want you to share why you picked them. What is it about them, about the way they operate, about the scope of their influence, that makes you think of the industrial legends of the 19th century? Let us know your thoughts, your personal analysis, in the comments below. This isn't just a casual question. It's an invitation for you to become part of a larger conversation, an open forum where we dissect the present through the lens of history. We want to hear your unique take, see the debates that unfold, and together discover which names, which trends are truly shaping our future, and what lessons we can draw from that. If you found this video helpful, if these breakdowns sparked something new in you, a fresh way of seeing how the past shapes our present, then take just a second and hit the like button. That's the best way to tell YouTube this content deserves to be shared, deserves to be seen by more people. And more importantly, it's how you support the channel and give us a huge boost of motivation to keep investing time and effort into researching and creating deeper, higher quality content for you. Your support is priceless. And if you don't want to miss any future human-centered deep dives into history, economics, or fascinating stories about how the world really works, how seemingly dry historical fragments are packed with powerful lessons we can apply to modern life, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you get notified whenever a new video drops. Join a community of curious minds, people who love to dig beneath the surface and explore the stories behind events, the timeless lessons hidden there with us. We truly believe that together, we can build a space for knowledge that really matters. Knowledge becomes stronger when it's shared. If you know someone who's wrestling with similar questions, or who simply loves impactful historical stories, stories about extraordinary people, and the decisions that changed entire eras, then don't hesitate to share this video with friends, family, or anyone you think might find value in it. Let's spread the flame of learning together, open up meaningful conversations, and connect with others who love to explore. Because history isn't just a collection of things that happened, it's a compass that helps us understand the world we live in and make wiser decisions for the future. And before we say goodbye for now, I want to give you a small teaser for our next journey. This discussion of the age of big business doesn't stop with individuals. In an upcoming video, we may dive deeper into another crucial side of the big business era, the role of government and law and regulation in reining in the power of these tycoons. Is it enough to rely on extraordinary individuals, or do we also need systems of oversight to ensure fairness and sustainability? From early antitrust laws to today's challenges in regulating giant tech corporations, what lessons can we draw about balancing innovation with social responsibility? Stay tuned. I'm sure it will be a fascinating exploration and incredibly relevant to the moment we're living in. Thank you so much for spending your time watching, listening, and reflecting with us. Every view, every comment, every share from you is a huge source of motivation and inspiration for us to keep going, to keep bringing you stories and analyses that have real value. Remember, the story of the world isn't written only by the great individuals of the past. It's also being written by us, the people who think together, discuss together, and build a strong knowledge community together. I'll see you in the next video where we'll continue writing a new chapter in the story of power and how our world is shaped.